a round of applause to...
Well, thank you very much, Tim. It's genuinely great to be here. This is, I've never been to Lincoln before, which is a big regret because it's a wonderful town. What a staggering place, and what a great university you built here. Certainly, before I came, I didn't really know there was a university here, but it's really very impressive. So thanks for the invite, and thanks for letting me choose this topic. So this is, as Tim mentioned, I mean, part of my life is trying to put rationality into drug policies. And I've argued a lot about the flaws in current regulations and how they actually do more harm than good, if anything, make the problem worse. But tonight I'm going to focus on another aspect which has come much more into prominence in my life in the last decade, when I started to research some of these most controlled drugs, particularly psychedelics and MDMA. And I realized that this is the challenge of doing this research is so enormous, and it's enormous because of the war on drugs and the attitude that regulators and governments have to drugs. So that's the title of my talk, Is and Casualties, because most of you, and certainly I didn't realize quite how destructive the war on drugs was to non-drug users, to scientists, so that's what I'm going to tell you about today. But I guess we should start with the fact, or the incident that most people got to know me through, which was being sacked. There's me being pulled away from my bench by the Home Secretary, who of course was from a county just a bit north of here, so we clearly not very competent. And I was sacked because, well, you can see why I was sacked. The cartoon really sums it up. I was arguing that cannabis was less harmful than alcohol and tobacco, and that didn't fit with the government policy at the time. It certainly doesn't fit with the government policy today. And since we've got two different governments then, that was Labour, this is now Conservatives, it clearly was something that most politicians in Britain really don't want to accept, but it's true, of course. But what was remarkable about that week of being sacked, that week, is it was the same week as Andre Agassi. For the young ones amongst you, you might not know who he was. It was a tennis player. He was a very good tennis player on Wimbledon. And after Wimbledon, he tested positive for crystal meth, amphetamine. And in those days, well, still today, you all know about Sharapova, who took something much less interesting than crystal meth and got banned for 2 years. He should have been banned for taking crystal meth. But he basically lied about it. He said, no, your tests are wrong. The tests don't work very well. And so go away and try to improve on the quality of your tests. And the Wimbledon authority said, oh, that's great. You must promise us, Andre, you'll never ever do another urine test. He never did. Well, if he did, he never handed it in. But what's remarkable about that is his biography, when it was published, was sold on the grounds that he lied about taking drugs. And that's an interesting contradistinction, isn't it? I get sacked for telling the truth about drugs. He makes millions for telling people he lied about drugs. And it kind of sums up the fact that there was not a great deal of logic in this whole debate. And actually, this also tells you that there are some things perhaps even more important than drugs like tennis. But anyway, that's another story. Now, there are many problems with current drug policy. These are the 9 I would normally talk about, but I'm not going to talk about all of them today because we haven't got time. I'm going to focus largely on this one, this growing knowledge of how the drug laws really impede research and clinical treatment. But let's just say a little bit about this one here, the red one. Because there's still, most people assume that, well, even though banning drugs doesn't necessarily stop people using them, people assume there must be some value in it. And what the people who live in that kind of false hope, just don't know the last 100 years of history, because we've been trying to do that since about 1908, where we banned opium because we didn't like the fact that there were Chinese people smoking opium, and we got hysterical about that in the East End of London. And we created a fiction that it was actually going to essentially undermine Englishness. And what happened? Well, people stopped smoking opium and they started injecting morphine and heroin. Not a good thing. And all along, we see the problems with ethanol prohibition, cannabis prohibition, even to spice. And there's almost no example where prohibition hasn't led to something worse coming along. And of course, it's culminated in this remarkable phenomenon in America. Now, when more Americans died last year, or the year before, in fact, before COVID, of opioids than died in the Vietnam War. They're dying in the face of powerful prohibition of these drugs for a very long time. So it's clearly the case that we ought to be thinking differently about how we deal with the problems of drugs, if we actually care about people dying. I mean, there are cynics who think, see, a lot of politicians don't care, they prefer people to be dead, but most of us don't share that belief. So my talk today is largely going to focus on the opportunities that these banned drugs have been lost because we have taken this absurd view that these drugs are too dangerous even to be used by doctors. Because all these drugs are banned, certainly except cannabis still are banned. They're all banned under the Misuse of Drugs Act in this country and under the UN conventions. They're banned in a class which says, or a schedule as it's called, which says they are very, very dangerous and have no medical value. Which is kind of fascinating, isn't it? Given that they're neither very, very dangerous, they do have a lot of medical value. And the regulations which surround drugs which are in Schedule 1 of the UN Conventions, the Misuse of Drugs Act, are so oppressive it's virtually impossible to work with them. And the reality is that that decision back in the late 1960s to ban these drugs has had an enormously deleterious effect on research. And of course we know that because researchers have a very powerful metric of research, and that's called publications. So just look here. So the blue line of the number of publications each year for LSD, and the red one underneath is psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. So LSD was discovered in the 40s, made available in the early 50s, and a massive increase in research. Hundreds of papers, ending up with 300 or 400 papers a year being published on LSD. Why was that? Well, two reasons. Because the US government funded 140 trials of LSD, because they saw this as being a revolution in understanding brain and brain science. And because about 1,000 doctors around the world were using it therapeutically. It was seen as, it was actually the very first proper medical treatment we had in psychiatry, because in the early 1950s we didn't have antipsychotics. And in America they didn't anyway. We didn't have antidepressants. The first antidepressant came along in about 57. Whereas LSD was being used to treat anxiety, depression and addiction in the 50s. So it was the first revolution. The first time psychiatry was actually, psychiatrists had a tool. It was comparable power to other forms of medicine. And then the ban came in, the Americans banned in 67, the UN banned in 71, and you can see the number of publications virtually disappeared. And there was certainly not written, but definitely an attempt by the international community to eliminate all knowledge of these drugs. There was an ambition, I heard said by particularly US regulators, they would like never ever anyone ever to know that LSD existed, and no one would ever research it again. And it was a very clever tactic, because if you don't allow people to research the drug, you can't find out that it isn't harmful. You can't find out that it is useful. So it became a kind of very clever, self-fulfilling prophecy. And the reasons for that massive decline are twofold. From this point on, the Americans never funded another study, and since they fund about 8% of all biomedical research in the world, that meant most researchers couldn't have access to the funds needed to do the studies. And even if you could get funding, and a few people did, people like Rick Strassman, who wanted to study DMT, they managed to get some philanthropic money to study the drug. It was almost impossible to get hold of the drug. It could take you years and years and years in order to go through the bureaucracy, the deliberate hurdles to stop you getting access. So it was a double whammy. And in fact, it's only in the last few years that things have begun to pick up. And I'll tell you why that is in a minute. But what a lot of people don't know about is that rising phase of LSD research, when the drug was legal, was enormously influential in terms of modern science. And here are two Nobel Prize winners who were users of LSD. The bottom one, Kerry Mullish, you've probably never heard about, but you all know what he achieved, because you've all done it. You've all done a PCR test. I mean, most of you probably don't know what PCR stands for, but it stands for polymerase chain reaction. Why do we have a PCR? Because this guy got the Nobel Prize for discovering it. Why did he get the Nobel Prize for discovering it? Because it revolutionized our understanding of DNA. How did he discover it? He discovered it when he was trying to work out how he could get enough of this stuff that was enough DNA, which was discovered, the structure of which was discovered by this man, Crick, in Watson. Gerald Mullis was trying to work out how he could get enough of this to do some biochemistry. And he says quite explicitly that during an LSD trip, he saw the double helix unraveling like a series of serpents, replicated. And he realized he had to find an enzyme to do that. And he went away and he hunted around, and in a bacterium he found a polymerase enzyme, which he put into DNA, and it started replicating the strand of DNA. And now he got the Nobel Prize. He said he wouldn't have got it without LSD. And we all got the benefits of PCRs, from our nose swabs. But they're more useful than that as well. When you eat tonight, if you want to know whether you're having a hamburger or a horse burger, you just PCR it. PCRs underpin almost all food safety and a vast amount of medical testing. What about Crick? Well, Crick, in 1953, wrote a paper where he basically told us how life was coded. And then a few years later, he took LSD, and he realized actually that achievement of discovering the alphabet of life was actually pretty trivial, because he'd already done it. The only challenge he had left in his life was actually to understand the brain, and he wrote this book, which now seems quite quaint, The Astonishing Hypothesis, he called it. And that astonishing hypothesis is actually the mind that comes out of the brain. It actually isn't a separate entity. And he spent the remaining 30 years of his life trying to understand the brain science, which had been inspired in him by taking psychedelics. But he couldn't study psychedelics because he wasn't allowed to. The same is somewhat true of cannabis. You see, cannabis began to become very interesting to scientists at the same time in the 60s, when we began to understand that cannabis worked on receptors in the brain. And then it got sucked into the same ban, the Schedule I ban. The duration of impediment to research was only then about 20 odd years, and it's now caught up. The ban on psychedelics still exists. There's no country in the world that hasn't repealed the UN Conventions on Psychotropic Medication. Some countries allow access to drugs like ayahuasca, promoting mushrooms, but none of them have repealed the convention. And I'm going to say to you now, I believe that those bans, those 1971 UN bans, are the worst censorship of research in the history of the world. In fact, I cannot think of any example in human history where there's been a global ban on research equivalent to that. The best I can come up with, and if any of you know better, let me know, it was a long time ago. It was 1616 when the Pope of the Catholic Church banned the teachings of this man, Copernicus. And kind of appropriate, isn't it, that we're actually in the Isaac Newton lecture theatre? Because if Newton had been a Catholic, he wouldn't have been able to write what he wrote about the orbits of the planets. But anyway, that's another story. The Catholic Church didn't like the fact that Copernicus had worked out that the Earth was not the centre of the universe, that the Earth went around the sun, not the other way around, and that conflicted with Catholic teaching. So they banned his writings for about 140 years, and they executed anyone who spoke about them, and they gave Galileo the interesting conundrum, do you recant your science, or do you stick with your science and get killed? So he decided to recant, but I think he thought his legacy would live on, because he'd written about it, so he wanted to carry on studying it, but not proclaiming it. But that didn't, although extended across the whole Catholic world, which is quite a big world. It wasn't the whole of the world. The Northern European Protestants could carry on looking at the stars and the planets with impunity. And actually, there weren't that many astronomers. But in the last 50 years, what is it, 51 years now since the ban, there are hundreds of thousands of neuroscientists and psychologists and psychiatrists that have been denied access to these tools for research and for clinical practice. And that is why I say it is the worst censorship of research in clinical practice in the history of the world. And if you want to read more about it, here are a couple of reviews that I've written. So those of you who don't have access to university libraries, you want to read this one because that's a freebie. I'll just say one interesting thing about this paper here. Nature Reviews Neuroscience is a very, very prestigious journal. Those of you who are in science will know that. And they asked me to write this article. And they said, we'd like you to have an American author as well, because we want the Americans to read it. You know, they won't read an article that's just written by a Brit. So I approached the American who was doing the most similar work to us in terms of psychedelics. And I said, great opportunity, we're going to get the definitive review on psychedelic research in Nature Reviews Neuroscience. And they said, David, they said, if I do that, I will never get a grant from neither, again, the American funder of drug research. I will never get a grant again if I do that. So in the end, that paper, that Nature Neuroscience paper, is authored by two extremely old men who both retired, King and Nichols, and me, who was a pretty old man, because young neuroscientists were too terrified. And that is, you know, for those of you who aren't scientists, you'll find that horrific. Those of you who are scientists know that kind of pressure we have to live with all the time. The establishment often doesn't like what we do. So what are these psychedelics that we've been talking about? Let's look into their history and get a bit more clues as to why people should be so frightened by them. So when we're talking about psychedelics, we're largely talking about serotonergic molecules which come from plants or fungi. So here's the peyote cactus, which makes mescaline. Here's one of over 200 species of magic mushrooms which grow all over the world that make psilocybin. Here's ayahuasca. This is a fascinating cocktail. This is a brew which is made of two plants, one that contains DMT. But if you drink DMT, your liver chews it up so fast you don't get an effect. And the indigenous peoples of the Amazon had worked out, maybe thousands of years ago, that if you brew it up with another plant, which contains a substance called harmaline. Harmaline is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and it blocks the liver breakdown of DMT. So you can drink DMT, so this is the drinkable form of DMT. Mostly, when we research DMT now, we have to give it intravenously because we're not allowed to use this cocktail. There's Amanita muscaris, which is the mushroom that produces hallucinations. That's the mushroom which underpinned the Alice in Wonderland experience, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But this is a different kind of psychedelic. It's not a serotonergic psychedelic. But it was widely used in Roman times, and there's a nice little mosaic recipe book showing how you make mushroom tea. You throw them into a bowl. And then there's morning glory seeds and ergot, the fungus that grows on wine. And these both make derivatives of ergotamine, which are psychoactive. And the most important image is this one here. This is a Greek vase. It's 3,000 years old, and it shows the Greek god Demeter partaking of ergot and alcohol, wine. And the Greeks knew that ergot was psychoactive, so they basically waited till the autumn when the dew allowed the ergot to grow on the rye. And then they went into the fields and they had their celebrations. They were called the Mysteries, the Eleusinian Mysteries, and they were empowered by a cocktail of psychedelic fungus and alcohol. And in those mysteries, there were enormous amounts of creative dance and music and theatre. And then after that, after their sort of a couple of weeks of really engaging in those activities, they went back to the city-states, and they went back to doing what the Greeks, of course, have left their legacy for us, which is things like geometry and logic and philosophy, and also democracy. And you can make a very strong case that the whole underpinning of Western culture, which is of course ancient Greek culture, was driven through the insights that they got from their using this psychedelic. But that's Western culture. What about Eastern culture? Well, it's almost indisputable that psychedelic drugs were involved in the beginnings of Hinduism. I mean, why else would some of their gods have so many arms? And here's Shiva, who was powerfully intoxicated by going to sleep under a cannabis bush. And of course, there are studies in India who use cannabis in a ritual way on a daily basis today. And the other drug that was used in ancient India was soma. And the best estimate we have of soma is some cocktail of cannabis, magic mushrooms, and ephedra, the stimulant. To my mind, that sounds like a very interesting cocktail. Someone should be making it. The British caught on to drugs once they got to India and to China. And the British Empire was essentially built on forcing the Indians to buy cannabis from us. Even though cannabis grows wild in India, we controlled the market and forced them to buy it. And we forced, in the opium wars, we forced the Chinese to buy opium from us because we wanted to restore the imbalance. We were spending so much money on tea from China. We forced the Chinese to pay us back by buying opium, which we grew in India and sold to the Chinese. So we were unquestionably the largest drug dealer the world has ever seen. We put the Mexican cartels, into trivial. And a lot of our economic strength came from that. But there were beginnings of distaste in British society, like in the 1880s, 1890s, over drug use generally, and a lot of it, part of it centred on this, what was seen by some as iniquitous use or selling of cannabis to Indians. There was a concern that cannabis was driving people into mental institutions in India. So Parliament in 1893 set up the Indian Hemp Commission, which spent a year reviewing the relationship of cannabis to mental health in India. And it's a magnificent document because it's exactly the same as you write today. Nothing has changed really in 100, 120 years other than some of the preparations of cannabis. But the reality is that cannabis, when it's used moderately, is not harmful to mental health. So that was the beginning of concerns with prohibition in Britain. Of course, prohibition has been around for longer than that. The beginnings of prohibition came with the Quran and the opposition to alcohol, and subsequently to cannabis, which are both effectively outlawed by Islamic teaching. They tried to outlaw coffee and tobacco, but it was harder to know when people had taken those, so they never succeeded. Cannabis began to become widely used in Britain in the middle 1800s. And this man, William O'Shaughnessy, set up the first cannabis pharmacy in London. And he was a doctor who'd been in India and had seen the benefits of medical cannabis. He had seen that you could use medical cannabis to treat childhood epilepsy. And you could also use it to treat the spasms of tetanus, which is a very unpleasant and painful way to die. And he promoted the use of medical cannabis in Britain. And it was widely used, and in fact it was used by the most powerful woman in the world, probably ever been, Queen Victoria. She used it for the pains of childbirth and period pains, and she wrote positively about its benefits to her. And in fact, cannabis was a legal medicine in Britain until 1971. And we banned it in 1971 under the Misuse of Drugs Act because we had been pressured by America to do so. In fact, all our drug laws in this country until the 2016 Psychopharmacology Substances Act were made at the behest of America. Not instantly, because America banned cannabis as a medicine in 1934. But we held out, but eventually we gave in. I don't know what the deal was. It was Jim Callaghan's government. They didn't keep notes as to how much or what America was giving us, but eventually we conceded and banned it in 1971. And of course, the sad reality is that the Americans unbanned it in their states just a few decades later, but we haven't really unbanned it yet. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But other drugs were available. Cocaine was that you could soothe your baby to sleep with your cocaine elixir, you could deal with your toothache with heroin. It is now a good treatment for toothache. Okay. And people started selling polydrug products. You know, this is a wine which was liberally laced with cocaine, and it was reputed that this Pope, Leo XIII, became an addict of Mariani wine, and he gave him a gold medal so they keep supplying him for free. So drugs were generally pretty available, but it was the over-the-counter availability both of drugs and alcohol in the 1890s that led to the rise of the temperance movement. So and these were hugely powerful social reformers, and they wanted lots of good things. You know, they wanted sanitation, and they wanted people to have a living wage, but they were really anti-drugs. They were anti-alcohol, and they were anti-over-the-counter drugs like cannabis and tinctures of cocaine and heroin. And they basically began the lobby to get those drugs removed. And they ended up being very, very successful because they managed in America to get alcohol back in 1920. But they were hugely powerful in Britain too. In, I think, the 1923 general election, Winston Churchill stood in Dundee, and he got about 12,000 votes. The temperance movement got 24,000 votes. It was pretty much touch and go whether we would actually ban alcohol in Britain, like the Americans did, because the temperance movement was so powerful. But there are other factors. I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. The political factors, competing interests in the pharma industry, and the impact of the Drug Enforcement Agency following alcohol prohibition. Let's talk a bit about the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry existed, or the founding platform of the pharma industry was taking plant products which had been known for millennia and then slightly modifying them and turning them into IP, which they could then sell. So heroin and morphine were both extracts of opium, but were then patented. Aspirin was salicylic acid taken from willow bark, had an acetyl group added, turned it into a patentable medicine. And amphetamine was the drug which was made to look very much like the ephedra, which was which comes from plants. And having done that, the industry has fought a battle which has been very successful. They've pretty much eliminated any alternative plant products. In the British Pharmacopoeia, there is not a single plant product that we, as doctors in Britain, can describe. We have succumbed to their pressure. In Germany, interestingly, where Bayer is and many other companies, they do allow plant products. The Germans have about 20 medicines which are plant extracts, but we don't have any. And the same, that antipathy or that pressure of the pharma industry against plant products is one of the reasons we have very little access to medical cannabis. Alcohol prohibition was an enormously influential social event. It led to the rise of the mafia. It led to corrupting. Every single policeman in America was corrupted because the speakeasies, the illegal drinking dens, paid them off. So the Americans had to create, they're the only country in the world that has its own army against drugs. It's called the Drug Enforcement Agency now. And it was set up, the Untouchables were set up to be uncorruptible, and they were run by this man, Harry Anslinger, and they fought the mafia. And the American people eventually realized that they weren't winning the war against the mafia, and so they decided to make alcohol legal again. But poor Harry was then left with a problem. He was the second most famous man in America after Hoover. And he was going to lose his job, and he'd lose 35,000 of his men would lose their jobs too. So he came up with a plan. Let's find another drug that we can enforce prohibition on. And he decided the drug was cannabis. But in keeping with some modern despots in the same country, he decided to blame the Mexicans for it. He changed the name from cannabis to marijuana so that he could make it more obvious it was a Mexican problem. And he created this hysteria you can see on these images. It's absolutely classic, isn't it? You know, semi-naked women and the threat of poisoning, young people being poisoned, or foreigners coming in and doing naughty things to us, you know, white women. Racist policy, like most drug policies since then. very effective. He kept his job, his army kept their job, and they carried on. Now they don't fight much. Most of America has legalized cannabis, but it's still illegal under federal law and in federal land. So they still do arrest lots of people who are caught smoking cannabis in places like Yellowstone Park, where you're not allowed to. And by the way, if you are going to the States, it's a minimum 7 years in prison for the first offence. So you need to be very careful when you smoke cannabis, even though it's illegal in about 17 states. And recreationally legal. It's medically legal in 30. Now, the drinks industry learned their lesson from Prohibition. They realized that they have to separate themselves from drugs. And this is just a wonderful advertisement. Say no to drugs, that way you'll have more time to drink. The idea that alcohol is not a drug is, of course, fanciful, but it's very compelling. We all want it not to be a drug, don't we? And certainly politicians want it not to be a drug because they drink a lot. And it's been very successful. The drinks industry has created a myth that actually not only is alcohol not a drug, it's also actually, in many ways, beneficial to health, even though it causes it's responsible for at least 8 cancers and vast amounts of liver disease. So they won that argument. We cannot fight them anymore. We've accepted that alcohol is a legal drug. The drugs haven't always been so vilified. In fact, I'd like to make the case that the free world was saved by amphetamine sulfate. World War II was won, as you know, by us and the Americans, the Allies, and all our soldiers and seamen and airmen were given amphetamine sulfate, benzodrine. Hey, I can see an advert. Buy benzodrine, send it to your soldiers in the Pacific. The Axis powers, the Germans and the Japanese, they thought they were cleverer than us because they made a new drug called methamphetamine, crystal meth, which was more powerful and longer lasting. But they didn't realize that that was a bad thing, because if you take it every day, you don't sleep. And after a short while, you start hallucinating, and you start behaving very strangely. And I think it's the fact that they used basically too potent a drug that they actually eventually undermined the war effort. But anyway, whatever, you might disagree with me, but at least the war on drugs was the war with drugs, perhaps you should say. But the war on drugs started with Nixon. Now, Nixon was a Republican. He was trying to get elected, having lost an earlier election to Kennedy. He was in favor of the Vietnam War, but the American people were anti the Vietnam War. So he had to distract them from thinking about that. So he decided to create a new problem, a problem in America that he could focus his attention on as the savior. And this wonderful invention by his main advisor, Ehrlichman, said this. The Nixon 1968 campaign had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be anti-war or black. I bet they thought about it, but of course in many states, blacks didn't even have a proper vote. But anyway, they couldn't do that. But what they could do, if you can read it there, what they could do was attack people because they were drug users. And it was very successful. They could vilify them night after night on the evening news. We could disrupt their meetings. We could attack them as a population. Fantastic campaign. He went from being the underdog to winning every state except Maine. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So this was just a policy to get elected. And I'll say it now in case I forget to say it later. Every single drug policy that has been made in this country and that country in the last 100 years has been made for political reasons. None of them have been made for health reasons. And because America, until very recently, controlled all international decision-making, particularly through the WHO and the UN, we have slavishly, as has almost all the rest of the world, done exactly what the Americans told us. The only country that hasn't actually signed the UN Convention to make psychedelics and cannabis illegal is actually North Korea. But it's hard to research that. Now, so the lies that have been told about drugs underpin the war on drugs. And here's just some great quotes from 2 very eminent people. scientist here, Charles Darwin, false facts are very injurious to science, for they injure them. And the psychologically somewhat more astute Mark Twain, how easy it is to make people believe a lie, and how hard it is to undo that. And the reality is that the majority of doctors and scientists believe that drugs like LSD and magic mushrooms are very dangerous and very addictive because they're in Schedule 1 of the UN Conventions. They cannot really understand that that's a complete myth, fabrication. Well, that's enough of the background. Let's talk about where we're going, fighting back. Well, I'm going to talk largely now about psychedelics, but I'm just going to mention medical cannabis, because even though we have medical cannabis in Britain now for 3 years, there have only been 3 prescriptions on the NHS because the medical profession refuses to believe it's medicine. Actively refuses, even though 1.4 million people every day in Britain use illegally sourced medical cannabis for disorders like chronic pain, depression, and anxiety. The medical profession, who I've been attacking repeatedly, and I can do that because I'm a doctor, this is one of the worst examples of willful blindness in medicine I think there may have ever been. 3 prescriptions in 3 years. Despite evidence like this is an audit we did on 10 children with severe epilepsy. All these children have failed on multiple other anticonvulsants. Some of them had surgery. And they all benefited from medical cannabis. This is a log scale. So some of these children were having over 10,000 seizures a month. They were basically, they couldn't go to school, they were in hospital all of the time. And some of them, the seizures disappeared with medical cannabis. But they cannot get medical cannabis on the NHS because the doctors don't believe that this is real data, because it's not been done in a placebo-controlled fashion, even though these children's lives are being transferred. So parents and that are paying thousands of pounds a month to keep their children alive, and actually saving the NHS tens of thousands of pounds a month because they're not in hospital. But we doctors won't allow the prescription, and pharmacists block the prescriptions if the doctors want it, because we don't believe in plant medicine. What about psychedelics? Well, we now have some rather interesting data that begins to talk to the evidence that was developed in the 50s and 60s about psychedelics for disorders like depression and anxiety. So this is the first modern day study of psychedelics, in this case psilocybin, magic mushroom juice, in people with resistant depression. This is a study we did. They all failed on 2 antidepressants. Some had failed on 10. They'd all failed on CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. They were given a single dose, the 25 milligram, a trip dose of psilocybin, and they all got better. And some of them are cured, and some are still cured 8 years later. Not many, but some are cured. But that single dose impact on depression scores is the biggest treatment effect in resistant depression there's ever been. To get the same effect with ECT, you've got to give 10 or 12 seizures. So this is a profoundly powerful effect, and it's recently been replicated by a pharmaceutical company called Compass Pathways, who've done the same study. So this is a potential revolution, because psilocybin will work in people where other antidepressants haven't worked. How does it work? Well, it changes the way people think. The top diagram here shows a phenomenon that depressed people have, which is called pessimism bias. Depressed people see the world as a threatening, hostile, unpleasant place. They're actually right. But that doesn't help you get better. Most of us, most of you here, have what's called an optimism bias. You basically think the world is going to get better than it is, and that helps you survive. Well, psychedelic treatment doesn't actually make depressed people optimistic, but it does get rid of that pessimism bias. And here you can see, here's a description from one of our patients. My outlook has changed significantly. I'm more aware now it's pointless to get wrapped up in endless negativity. I feel I've seen a much clearer picture. And here's another patient. It was like you defragged the hard drive on your computer. I experienced things being rearranged in my mind. My mind works differently now. I ruminate much less, and my thoughts feel ordered, contextualized. Rumination was like thoughts out of context, out of time. Now my thoughts feel like they make sense with context and logical flow. This resetting of aberrant thinking in depression is something that most of our patients talk about. And if you want to read the narrative, they're very moving, and it's in this as a result of that study, my postdoc, Waddy Harris, and I came up with a new theory. We believe there are two different ways you can lift depression down. You can lift it with conventional antidepressants, which work in the stress centers of the brain to basically protect the brain from stress and allow the brain to heal. And the reason these drugs take 6 to 8 weeks to work is because it takes that long for the brain to heal. In the same way, you've got a plaster on a broken leg to let the bone heal. Whereas psychedelics work in a different part of the brain. They work in the cortex and a different receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor, and they fragment depressive thinking and allow depressed patients to escape from these repetitive ruminative loops that they get locked into. So that was a great theory, and in fact we went out and tested this theory. Just last year we published a paper after 3 years research comparing psilocybin with the gold standard SSRI antidepressant escitalopram. And we showed some rather interesting findings. We showed that if you look on the right-hand side here, that both drugs reduced depression scores. The psilocybin worked faster and was better over 6 weeks. And if you look on the left-hand side, which is the obverse of depression, you get well-being. This is the Warwick Edinburgh well-being scale. Psilocybin rapidly increased the sense of well-being, and escitalopram increased it, but less and more slowly. And this has supported our view that they're working in different ways. Now, we're not the only people who've worked in this field. There have been several studies in America looking at end-of-life anxiety and depression in response to psilocybin. There's a depression study here from Johns Hopkins giving people with depression psilocybin, which worked, and keeping them on the waiting list, which didn't. There have been a couple of studies of ayahuasca. And also now there are studies going on in our group, in other groups, with conditions such as OCD, anorexia, and pain. And you might say, well, what have they all got in common? And the answer is they're all disorders where people's thoughts get locked into patterns which they don't want, but from which they can't escape. And the reason for that is because the brain changes in depression, and psychedelics disrupt that. So for those of you who are actually interested in the science, you can read this mini review of it, which shows that where these drugs work on this particular subtype of neurons of the brain that coordinate brain function, and how they disorganize, synchronize brain activity, allowing a much more open, hyper-connected brain. So this is what happens during a trip. We also know now from what we call post-translational, backward translational animal work that psychedelics make neurons grow bigger and better and stronger, and synapses grow more. So we not only do these drugs disrupt negative thinking, they also allow you to get into a state of positive thinking, which you can then enhance by the laying down of new memories with these new synapses. And some of you may have heard this in the news relatively recently, a couple of weeks ago. We've subsequently analysed the data from those two trials to look at how connected the brain is following these treatments. And psilocybin increases the connectivity of the brain, so the patients can think in a more fluid way. And the illustration is here that in disorders like depression, the brain becomes more modular. Different networks in the brain become more segregated from each other. So the analogy here is a landscape that has a lot of deep valleys and high hills. And if you get into a valley with a repetitive depressive thinking, it's very hard to get out of that valley. The psychedelics flatten the landscape of the brain. They increase connectivity during the trip. And what we've shown in depressed people is that flattening persists afterwards. And that's why depressed people can think more cogently and more normally, because their brains are not as polarized as they were before. So that's depression. What about problems of addiction? Well, there's George Best. Here he is, dying in hospital after a second liver transplant, dying of alcohol-related cirrhosis. The first real intervention in terms of treating alcoholism, certainly in modern times, was the development of AA. And AA was founded by this man, Bill Wilson. And Bill Wilson was an alcoholic for 15 years, until when he was 33, he had a trip. You can read the description of his trip, during which he saw that he had the ability to break off the shackles of his alcoholism. And that trip was induced by a drug called hyoscine, which is often used to augment effects of ayahuasca. But when LSD became available in the 50s, Wilson took LSD and was so profoundly affected by it. He was actually the guy that gave LSD to Huxley, because Huxley at that point he just used Huxley. And he thought this drug, LSD, could actually do for alcoholics what my trip did for me. It could allow them to see there was something more to life than just booze. And he persuaded the US government to fund 6 trials of LSD in alcoholism. Just 1 or 2 doses as part of that house in the place program. And a few years ago, these 2 Norwegians, Krebs and Johansson, went back and they got the source data. And they did a meta-analysis of the data. And they came up with this fact here. The effect size of LSD, 1 or 2 doses, in alcoholism is about 1. That's a big effect size. The effect size of modern treatments for alcoholism, such as ecamphosate or normophine, is about 0.3. So LSD is at least twice as powerful as the best treatments we have today. Why don't we use it? What? Because it's illegal. Why is it illegal? Because people wanted it not ever, the truth of it not to come out. And I've done a sort of simple calculation. I estimate that in the 50 years since LSD has been illegal, 100 million people worldwide would have died prematurely from alcohol dependence. Currently, it's 3.9 million deaths a year. If only 10% of them have benefited from LSD treatment, that would be 10 million lives saved. How many lives have been saved? Or how many deaths have been prevented by the banning of LSD? Probably none, but let's say maybe 100. Maybe 1,000, maybe 1 million. It's still, the equation is so much in favor of having it as medicine. And that is why this censorship is so iniquitous, because it hasn't actually stopped recreational use, but what it has done is stop it. Back in the 60s, it was also used to treat the most difficult addiction to treat, which is heroin addiction. This is the data from the one study in heroin addiction. I've been working in the field of addiction for nearly 40 years, and these outcomes, when almost everyone relapses in a year, is almost stunning. LSD, so everyone, there's a very significant benefit of LSD treatment in reducing relapse. So this, again, we've denied hundreds of thousands of heroin addicts have died who could have stayed alive if they'd been given access to LSD. Well, people are fighting back now. There's been a study of psilocybin in helping people stay abstinent from alcoholism. Basically, just 2 tricks in the middle of this abstinence-based course, and you see powerful reductions in the consumption of alcohol. So let's resurrect this to treat alcoholism. And I want just, in the last few minutes, talking about MDMA, because of course MDMA wasn't banned in 1971, but it got banned under the same convention when it became known. MDMA was discovered in 1904, but it was rediscovered by this man, Sasha Shulgin, in the 1970s. He tested every substituted amphetamine, hundreds and hundreds of them, but he saw that MDMA was different from everything else. It gave more clarity, more insight, and more empathy. He shared it with his wife, who's here, and she was a therapist, and she said, this drug is amazing. It actually can cut through all the crap it builds up in relationships over the years, and actually take couples who are fighting and put them back into love. And it was widely used in psychotherapy. Estimates are maybe 40,000 couples were treated with MDMA in the 70s and 80s. But what happened? A club in Texas owner realized it was a legal drug, legal amphetamine, started selling it. They then got to Ibiza, the rave scene started, and governments banned it. Why did they ban it? They banned it because they didn't like the idea that young people were having fun. There's no question, that was the way it was banned. But they couldn't ban it for that reason. So they had to make up stories about its harm. So they created hysteria about it causing brain damage, which it doesn't. And they banned it. But again, why take it out of medicine? Well, because the pharma industry didn't want it. Well, it's been resurrected. This organization in America called MAPS has been fighting for 30 years to get MDMA back as a medicine. They're a charity, they've raised money from donations, and eventually they have done now the first phase 3 study of MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. And so it's basically it's a standard PTSD course, something like 15 weeks of psychotherapy, but during that time they have 3 psychotherapy sessions under MDMA. And what you see here is that the impact of the MDMA is enormous, much greater improvements in the MDMA group than in the treatment, with the same treatment but with placebo. And here you see the proportion of people still ill after the full course of treatment on MDMA is less than 25% are still meet criteria for PTSD, whereas the ones that got placebo, over 75% still meet criteria. So this is a very powerful treatment for one of the most difficult disorders in psychiatry to treat. And they're now conducting the second phase 3 trial, and if that's equally positive, this will be a licensed medicine within a couple of years. How does it work? Well, if you want to learn more about it, you can read this little review I wrote. But the bottom line is it facilitates psychotherapy. We know that to help people overcome trauma, they have to remember the trauma, but cope with the emotion and eventually extinguish the emotion, because it's the emotional resurgences which destroy people's ability to function. If every time a door is slammed, you think you'll be blown up because you get this fear response, you can't function very well in life. MDMA, by suppressing amygdala activity very acutely, can allow people to properly engage in the therapy and get better outcomes like here. And a few years ago, my colleague Ben Sessa and I thought, well, a lot of the people we're treating who've got alcohol dependence, they've been traumatized. Often they've been traumatized in childhood. And they're drinking to suppress the pain of that trauma. So maybe if we could get rid of the trauma, they stop drinking. So we did a study where we took our standard, which was 11-week psychotherapy course, stopped people drinking through using willpower, motivation, interviewing, and inserted into that course 2 MDMA sessions. And you can see here comparative outcomes between our traditional treatment in red and the MDMA treatment in black. And traditional treatments, and we've known this for the last 20 years, is running these kind of treatment courses. About 2/3 of people relapse within about 6 months. Okay? 6 months, 2/3 relapse. But the MDMA group, less than 1/3 relapse. So this is an enormously powerful differentiator. And what we need to do now is go on and do randomized trials of MDMA versus placebo like that's done. But to do that is virtually impossible, because not only does the Schedule 1 status make it very difficult to do research, it also massively increases the cost. The bureaucracy you have to go through to get these drugs. I have to have a special safe put into my laboratory to store my MDMA and psilocybin. And when I say to the Home Office, why can't I put it alongside the heroin and fentanyl I'm working on? Oh, no, they're Schedule 2 drugs. But why are they Schedule 2 drugs? Because they're medicines. I said, well, if people are going to break into my lab, they've got a choice of psilocybin and MDMA or heroin and fentanyl. They're going to take heroin and fentanyl, aren't they? Why have I got to have more secure facilities? Because it's Schedule 1. And it's a circular argument, and it's absurd, and it's so destructive financially as well as emotionally. Just the last couple of slides, I just want to talk about some other opportunities that are currently being missed. One is snus. So snus is a form of tobacco that is a little tobacco pouch, like a tea bag. The Swedes use it, you put it under your lip, and you absorb the nicotine through your gum. Swedes have been using snus now for about 30 odd years. Swedish men do not get lung cancer anymore. It's gone. In fact, tobacco-related deaths in Sweden are the same as in countries where people don't smoke. So Islamic women have the same level of death. The death rates for all tobacco-related diseases for Swedish men are the same as Islamic women. It's amazing. It's transformed. And now it's just doing the same in Norway, which is outside the EU. Snus is not legal in the EU, it's only legal in Sweden. Now, we're not in the EU. We now have, as probably some of you know, the head of Bernardo's is now running a campaign to explore how we can reduce tobacco smoking in Britain. I asked a question of him a month ago, why are you not looking at snus, which has been proven over the last 40 years to eliminate tobacco smoking at home? And the response we got from the Home Office, we have no plans to review snus. I wrote back, you don't need to review snus. We've done it for you already. Here's the data. It's in the public domain. Why don't we allow snus to be sold here? They haven't told us to. We don't know why. Maybe the tobacco industry is still controlling the Home Office, like the drinks industry. And just to finish on drinks, one of the things, I spent most of my research career, which started back in 1977, trying to deal with the problems of alcohol. I invented antidotes to alcohol. I've developed new treatments of alcohol withdrawal, new anti-craving treatments, etc., etc. None of them have done anything really to impinge on the problems of alcohol. 2005, when I was in favour with the government, I was leading the government's foresight report on drugs in the future. And during that, we had a brainstorming session when it came to me that there was no way we could ever find antidotes to the problems of alcohol because it has such a wide negative impact on cancers, on liver disease, etc. And we thought, well, actually, why don't we just replace it? And I think for the last 15 years, I've been thinking how to do that. And the answer is, yeah, I'm writing about it, some things I've written. Modern neuroscience allows us to do that. I know how to replace alcohol. I've actually made molecules which are like alcohol, like low doses of alcohol, which I use. And I can, I gave it to you, you take that's like alcohol. And we're now in the process of trying to take it through the regulatory system to see if we can sell it as a food. The challenge is, the investors say, well, how do you know it's not being made illegal? And I say, well, why would you make it illegal if it's something much less harmful than alcohol? And they say, well, we make everything illegal in this country. Anyway, there's one thing they can't make illegal, which is food. So on the stepping stone to the synthetic alternative to alcohol, we made these botanic alternatives. So this is a combination of a number of herbs which work in the brain like alcohol through the GABA system. It's available, it's a food, it's therefore exempt from any kind of regulatory control that might apply to drugs. You can buy it now if you want to try it, and hopefully that will begin the debate about how we should be more rational about alcohol alternatives, and hopefully also give us some funding to pursue the ambition of actually having at least an alternative to alcohol, so that people who want to have sociability and conviviality don't run the risk of getting liver disease and breast cancer. So I'll stop now. If you want to read any more about what I've said, there's a few books. That's my autobiography, tells about my sackings, etc. My book on alcohol, my book on cannabis, my book on drugs. And the next one in this series will be my book on psychedelics, which will come out next April. And then finally, if any of you need medical cannabis, and I'm looking around, quite a lot of you probably do, because you're my age, you can go on the Drug Science website, my charity's website, and you can log into the 2021 initiative, and you can get access to a prescribing doctor. You'll have to pay for it, but we've set the price of medical cannabis at the same price as black market cannabis. So you won't lose money by getting it through here, and you're guaranteed to get proper medical cover, and you will also know what you're getting. It'll be the right stuff for you. So if you want that, or you've got relatives that want it, put them onto that website. You've got over 2,700 people in this initiative now. We're getting amazing data on the value. We're going to publish very soon the first 1,000 patients with pain who are using medical cannabis for pain. 44% of those have stopped using opiates. This is potentially going to be transformational in pain, in the same way as psychedelics will be transformational for depression. I'll stop now and take questions.